This week on Act Out, the Pentagon broadens its horizons to domestic surveillance and insurrection. The all-seeing eye is focused on the home front. Next, if we want to survive humanity's demise that our choices designed, we have to start making different choices, starting at the dinner table. Finally, Dr. Sheila Vakharia joins us to talk harm reduction, addiction, and drug policy. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. So last week, we talked about how Amazon is cozy with the CIA, DHS, and now ICE in perpetuating and growing the largest surveillance state in the history of humanity. Well, here's another story to log in the all-seeing eye files. On October 30th, Motherboard released a report showing that the social media posts of American citizens who don't like President Donald Trump are the focus of the latest U.S. military-funded research, which aims to predict large-scale protests and ultimately, of course, suppress and crush domestic dissent and rebellion. So back when the financial crisis hit in 2008, the DoD launched the multi-million-dollar Minerva Research Initiative, a research program that funded universities to model the dynamics, risks, and tipping points for large-scale civil unrest across the world, under the supervision of various U.S. military agencies. And while much of this focused on Arab Spring uprisings and, quote, regions of the world of strategic importance to the U.S., the social media monitoring tool created under Obama's presidency in 2011 had clear-cut domestic applicability. In August of this year, an obscure paper was released at the Big Data Conference in Kiev called Social Network Structure as a Predictor of Social Behavior, the case of protest at the 2016 U.S. presidential election. The study was funded by the U.S. Army Research Laboratory, which is part of the U.S. Army's Research Development and Engineering Command. The paper concludes that protests after the U.S. elections in 2016 could have been predicted by analyzing the Twitter posts of millions of American citizens in the lead-up to the demonstrations. And they, of course, know this because they analyzed, i.e. monitored and spied on Americans' social media accounts. And of course, they say predicted to mean stopped. Indeed, the paper not so subtly alludes to this by stating that failure to predict an unexpected protest may result in injuries or damage. Ah, yes, the broken windows excuse. Using the bogus threat of leftist violence as a reason to crush civil rights while simultaneously leaving white supremacist terrorists to roam free is a tried and true tool of the red, white, and blue. On this show, I have talked before about this dangerous trend of seeing property destruction as violence in a growing fascist state. And we can talk about that again sometime, but regardless of how you feel right now about broken windows versus broken lives, you should ask yourself if you want the state to use a burning trash can as a reason to spy on you, to add you to blacklists and corner you in a digital cage of surveillance. Furthermore, do you want community self-defense, i.e. punching Nazis, to be considered equivalent to fascist violence, state-sponsored and otherwise? If the answer to either of those questions is no, you should be very concerned about these new developments. Because beyond just the base issue of grotesque state surveillance lies the issue of self-policing. On some level, they probably don't even mind that this report came out. They're hoping that folks will read this and think, oh shit, I better watch what I say because I'm that person who has nothing to hide and I don't want them to think otherwise. They want people to pull back from political engagement and commentary out of fear, while at the same time making it far more difficult for those who are engaged to really know or understand what we're up against. Indeed, by using the private sector as a veil to cover up their work, the DoD can keep detailed information on technology and usage out of FOIA requests filed by organizations like the ACLU. In other words, they can keep their fascist Orwellian work out of the public eye, away from public scrutiny or, most importantly, accountability. In an attempt to sidestep that secrecy, the ACLU found patent applications filed by HRL Laboratories, owned by General Motors and Boeing, that relate to geographically locating social media users and tracking and predicting social event trends. As Motherboard reported, the body of scientific literature related to these patents demonstrates a sophisticated technology suite capable of locating the home positions of users to within 10 kilometers for millions of Twitter accounts, and predicting thousands of incidents of civil unrest from microblogging streams on Tumblr. Naturally, it doesn't just begin and end with finding out where we live and what we're planning. In April of this year, the Trump administration released an updated doctrine on homeland defense, and that states that military information support forces and equipment may also be used to conduct civil authority information support activities during domestic emergencies within the boundaries of the U.S. homeland. In other words, the militarization of the police is just the tip of the iceberg, one small smudge along the ever-blurred line between domestic law enforcement and the largest military in the world. The doctrine also states that classification of information between the DoD and civilian authorities should be removed so as to ensure free-flowing sharing of information. Your information. The doctrine goes on to explicitly say that a domestic insurrection would fall under the Pentagon's jurisdiction. These statutory provisions allow the president, at the request of a state governor or legislature, or unilaterally in some circumstances, to employ the U.S. Armed Forces to suppress insurrection against state authority, to enforce federal laws, or to suppress rebellion. The president can unilaterally sic the fucking army on you for organizing a protest. And that might sound hyperbolic, but you and I both know that they're the ones who get to decide what exactly constitutes an insurrection against state authority, or when military force is necessary to enforce federal laws or to suppress a rebellion. That won't be a public discussion. There won't be a vote. Just like there was no vote, no public discussion on whether or not your posts about what an absolute fuckwit Trump is should be pulled into the Pentagon's domestic surveillance program. With the elections behind us, folks might be wondering, well, okay, if there isn't a voting solution for this problem, what do I do? Put simply, do more. As I said, they want you to be scared. They want you to just be good proles who go to the polls every 2 years, as long as you're white, and then pat yourselves on the back for being good Americans. But that's just it. I don't want to be a good American. I want to be an autonomous human being that doesn't live in a fascist state. I don't want to stand for the anthem or take pride in a nation built on genocide and slavery. The nationalistic blindfold needs to come off. And I'm not here to say don't vote. I think you should if you can, especially on the local level, because change does come from the ground up. But if all you do is vote, know that you're not doing nearly enough. And I'm not going to sugarcoat that. Because more and more issues like this one are decided on and grown beyond the purview of our votes. What we need is precisely what this report shows that they're so afraid of: mass mobilization. They can call it an insurrection, but I call it giving a fuck and acting on it. Their power rests on our complicity. We have the responsibility to do what we can, each of us, based on our own abilities, to stop this. Each of us has an important role to play, far beyond the polls, on the front lines. Moving on, in order to essentially survive on this planet, humans need to eat way less meat. In fact, recent research shows that in Western countries, beef consumption needs to fall by 90% and be replaced by 5 times more beans and pulses. A pulse, before you ask, is the British term for dry peas, beans, lentils, and chickpeas. In short, a combination of greenhouse gases from livestock, deforestation, and water shortages from farming, and vast ocean dead zones from agricultural pollution mean that we cannot possibly address or mitigate the effects of climate change without significantly shifting how we eat. Indeed, earlier this year, research came out showing that without meat and dairy consumption, global farmland use could be reduced by more than 75%, an area equivalent to the US, China, European Union, and Australia combined, and still feed the world. Furthermore, loss of wild areas to agriculture is the leading cause of the current mass extinction of wildlife. And for you health nuts out there, while livestock accounts for more than 80% of all farmland, it accounts for only 18% of calories and 37% of protein. So, no need to bulk up on chicken and rice anymore, guys. Forget the chicken. Grab some tofu and pulses and pump some iron. And I know that many of you watching may be thinking, well, I only buy fair trade, grass-fed, free-range, etc., and that's good. Well, it's better. Because honestly, even grass-fed beef has far higher impacts on the environment than plant-based foods. Fish farms are also responsible for methane production, thanks to the stagnant conditions in which fish, food, and waste produce methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than CO2. Now, to be clear, for those of you watching this who are vegan, that is awesome. But this isn't a segment about how we should all quit eating meat and dairy cold turkey, which seems like an odd phrase to use here. Research shows that the cutbacks need to be drastic, absolutely, especially in the developed world, as noted in The Guardian. The researchers found a global shift to a flexitarian diet was needed to keep climate change even under 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. This flexitarian diet means the average world citizen needs to eat 75% less beef, 90% less pork, and half the number of eggs, while tripling consumption of beans and pulses, and quadrupling nuts and seeds. However, the millions of people in poor nations who are undernourished need to eat a little more meat and dairy. Flexitarian basically means that to eat and live consciously. For lots of folks, that does mean veganism, and for some, it doesn't. And I know I'm going to get hate for this, but honestly, everyone going vegan is neither realistic nor actually necessary. Everyone cutting back severely is. Many going vegan is a huge plus, but understand that in our system, that choice is a privilege. So before we get up on that soapbox, we gotta recognize the social and political systems that never allow folks the opportunity to make that choice. In the United States, more than 23.5 million people live in food deserts, and that is a very low estimate. Food deserts are areas where affordable and healthy, i.e. fruits and veggies, food is unattainable. Supermarkets are really far away, and fast food joints are a lot closer. This means that millions of impoverished folks are faced with a choice of a burger or no food at all. And I think we can all agree that that's not much of a choice. This issue must be addressed before we try and shame folks for not eating food that they don't actually have any access to. Furthermore, we also need to consider the environments that we live in. I lived in LA for 10 years and I could basically pick fruit right off of trees in some areas. Not so in parts of Sweden where I grew up. More traditional and localized ways of living will continue to incorporate meat into people's diets, both as an economic necessity, but also as an environmental one. The whole world shouldn't have access to mangoes in January. That's neither sensical nor sustainable. And yes, I know that traditional ways of living with a focus on meat are not the standard for most human beings, particularly in the so-called developed world. Veganism is without a doubt a great option and should definitely be encouraged. But we cannot cling to absolutism and forget to see how our privilege shapes our own choices and how it can shape disdain for those who aren't like us. I'll wrap by saying this. Everybody, eat way less meat and dairy. Also, everybody, get involved in the fight for food sovereignty and access, especially if you're working directly to push people towards veganism. And for some more act out coverage on this topic, check out episode 46 where we sat down with Less Meat, Less Heat. Finally, today we sit down with Dr. Sheila Vakharia, Policy Manager at the Office of Academic Engagement at Drug Policy Alliance, where she works on, among other things, harm reduction with regards to drug use and policy. As a doctor of social work, she has challenged the abstinence-only paradigm that leads the war on drugs mentality, as well as our hypocritical and arbitrary policies regarding the legalization of some versus other drugs. Her work also highlights the importance of looking at socioeconomic factors when discussing addiction. Take a look.
So I like to think of harm reduction as an umbrella that does encapsulate abstinence as a possible outcome. But harm reduction is really about working with people where they're at and trying to talk to them about how to stay safer and healthier. And sometimes staying safer and healthier is abstinence, right? Because that can be a way to eliminate risks. However, there's ways to stay safer while you're still engaging in perhaps otherwise high risk practices that may be associated with your drug use. And so a harm reductionist is willing to talk to you about making sure you're using sterile equipment, making sure that you're in a safe space when you're using, making sure that you have knowledge and resources about potential risks of sharing used equipment and access to testing if you're interested in finding out your status. It's about also helping people to connect with one another and learn that you can be supported in your journey and that you don't have to do it alone. I think harm reduction is about developing therapeutic and helping and healing relationships that center what your priorities are.
So part of this is also the social causes of addiction, which you've also talked a lot about. Talk about how this how our system creates this false addiction myth. And I saw a quote that was on a panel that you were a part of. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is social connection.
Absolutely. I think that there is this myth that drug addiction can be developed simply by the act of putting that substance in your body, that somehow this demon substance or drug will hijack any sort of reasoning or self control that you may be capable of otherwise, and thereby turn you into some sort of addicted person who then can no longer control one's impulses, will sacrifice anything and everything to get access to that substance. And although narrative can be compelling and gets lots of clicks and gets lots of interest, unfortunately, the story is often more complicated than that. Drug use does not occur in a bubble. People are unique. They come to their substance use experiences with certain expectations, certain pre existing experiences, perhaps mental health and social and other needs that might be getting met by that substance use. In addition to the fact that people are using within circumstances, they're using whether it's in the context of their friend circle or because they've seen other people do it or because they're reacting to challenges in their environment so that they have no control over, or perhaps to have fun and to enhance the positivity of an experience. And so social and environmental factors, as long as in addition to individual factors, have a huge role to play in how someone experiences a substance experience, and whether someone chooses to go back to it, and whether someone may develop a problematic relationship with that substance because it turns into a coping strategy that may come at a cost. I think that the vast majority of people who use substances don't develop addictions or don't develop problematic relationships. We know for a fact that 80 to 90% of people who've ever used a substance don't develop a problem. But what we do know about that small percentage of people who do develop problems is that oftentimes prior to use even, they might have had a mental health problem that may not have been addressed appropriately, or getting, that they weren't getting support or treatment around. Oftentimes those people may have had challenges in their social situations. They may have been in challenging employment or kind of workplace situations in which maybe they're underemployed or unemployed. They might also have had family challenges. And so we know that among that small percentage of people who develop problems, oftentimes, as I said before, their addiction didn't fall from the sky. It was very much a reaction, and oftentimes an adaptive attempt by the person to use the substance to cope with circumstances.
And part of that is also the prevalence for punishment in this country. The idea that there are prisoners that are behind bars simply for having had a substance on them or having done a substance. Talk about the issue. I mean, you mentioned the war on drugs earlier, but talk a little bit more about the issue of incarceration for drug use or having drugs.
Absolutely. We know that one of the biggest drivers of our current, crisis of incarceration is nonviolent drug possession. And we know that just the criminalization of certain amounts of substances means that even the occasional or recreational user can be targeted for criminalization. And what we also know about the ways in which our drug war has played out is that it's often used as a tool by law enforcement. It's often the lowest hanging fruit. It's the easiest thing to pin on someone, and particularly for populations who are already being over targeted by the criminal justice system. So we know that when it comes to people of color, particularly Black and Brown people and low income people, it's easy to pin a drug charge on someone. And it can often be the first line of contact that someone had with the criminal justice system that can lead to some really long term and often irreparable harms in that person's life.
So talk a little bit. I mean, since you work with the Drug Policy Alliance, talk about some of the policies that you'd like to see enacted from the issue of incarceration, but also harm reduction.
Absolutely. So, we at the Drug Policy Alliance are working in various different ways to address this large and multifaceted problem because it is such a large and complex issue. We need to come at it from different angles. So, one thing that we know about the war on drugs is that marijuana is often the substance for which many people have their first contact with the criminal justice system, and marijuana charges are actually the largest chunk of drug charges that we see people arrested for. So that is why we as an organization have been doing so much incredible work around marijuana legalization and reform. And we understand again that ending the war on marijuana and even ending the war on drugs isn't going to end racist policing. However, we know that it would remove one tool that they currently have in their toolbox for targeting marginalized people. And so marijuana reform is a huge area that we as an organization are working on. And we've had some tremendous successes across the country and hope to see many more in the coming years. And we work very closely with various partners and other organizations to do this work. Another area that we as an organization are trying to expand our work on is moving towards having conversations about decriminalizing the possession of all other classes of drugs as well. Because as I said before, marijuana is the largest driver of drug related arrests, but it's not the only substance that people get arrested for. And so moving towards the decriminalization of all other substances also then sends the message that drug use truly is a public health issue and not a criminal justice issue. And we believe that by diverting people out of harm's way, i.e., out of contact with the criminal justice system and law enforcement, it may help to increase their access to actual health supports, medical supports, social supports that we know are truly shown in the evidence to really help people overcome their problems rather than creating more barriers. And so, drug decriminalization is also an area that we're working on. And then I'd say, lastly, in terms of working within the system that we currently have, we've been doing some tremendous work, particularly on the state level in some of our states, about implementing law enforcement assisted diversion programs, where basically law enforcement are recruited into helping us to, when they do have contact with a person who used drugs in certain municipalities, to actually send them over to work with a case manager to get connected with services. And we just finished a trial, a 3-year trial in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it came up with tremendous positive results. It saved Santa Fe a lot of money. Police officers felt like they were helping, and it actually reduced a lot of the harms associated with people's drug use to address it that way. We're also trying to address issues with bail and bond reform because we know that cash bail is a huge reason why low-income people are often kept in jail even when they haven't been charged or convicted of any crime. So that's another area that we've been doing tremendous work in. And lastly, I'd say that we're doing amazing work in expanding access to harm reduction services. You know, we've been behind a lot of the fantastic naloxone access legislation that we've seen across the country. We're big proponents of Good Samaritan legislation. We believe that every state should have decriminalized syringe access so that every state can have syringe exchange programs. it's incredible to actually believe the fact that we have states across the country that don't have needle exchange programs. It's an outrage. So we're still doing work in that area, and we want to increase access to medication treatments like buprenorphine and methadone for people who need it the most, and also increasing access to those treatments for people who are incarcerated and people who are recently released from emergency rooms as well. So we're doing a lot of really great work, and even that doesn't capture all of it, but those are some highlights.
And this might be more of like a philosophical question, but do you feel that we're not making headway into, for example, safe areas where people can do drugs and have access to medical services and mental health services? Do you feel that we're not making headway because in order to do that, we'd have to address the social, economic, systemic racism issues that perpetuate drug use?
I do think that a lot of the solutions are band-aids in the circumstances that are allowed. Yeah, absolutely. I do think that universal health care, it would be a great way to address our overdose crisis. It would be a fantastic way to kind of get people into care. One of the things that we do know about people who aren't in treatment but who have substance use disorders is that the second top reason that they're not in treatment is because they don't have insurance coverage or can't afford treatment. And so absolutely, housing and housing instability can be a huge driver of, survival drug use. For a lot of people who are on the street, getting high is a way to survive being out there. Using methamphetamine and other stimulants is a way to stay awake and vigilant at night when you may be most likely to be targeted. And we know that getting drunk and getting intoxicated and being under the influence of opioids as well can help deal with some of the stress and trauma of being marginalized. And so again, absolutely, for a lot of people, these social determinants are such a huge driver of some of the harms that they're trying to face and cope with.
To learn more about Dr. Vakharia's work, visit her site, SheilaVakharia.com. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people that you don't know. Again, check out the last slide and the show description online in order to find sites that I have mentioned in this week's show. And for interim updates, make sure that you sign up for our newsletter at the address below. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please do keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not a violent man, but